If you go to, let's say, a store and you try on an article of clothing, it's scientifically proven that you get a little hit in your brain, that it makes you feel happy. And so that's why you can go to a store and try on a bunch of stuff and not buy anything. It's still a good experience. I'm talking about 52% of us, by the way. So when you go to a store and you try on something, you get this little, this is science, by the way. You get this little happy feeling, and it lasts, says science, all the way to when you carry it around the store and then you go to the register. It lasts right until you slide your credit card. And when they measure what's happening in your brain, then everything kind of goes flat. Unless the article of clothing you're buying is shoes. Science, you guys. Science says that if the article of clothing that you're buying is a pair of shoes, that little hit in your brain, it lasts longer. And so I wonder if that's why some of us, 52%, let's say, really love to go shoe shopping. Because when you go and you slide your credit card or you pay with cash or whatever it is, it lasts a little bit longer, and science has figured out maybe this is because we can convince ourselves that shoes are practical. That we have to have them, no matter what they look like. No matter if they look like a sculpture and aren't super wearable, we convince ourselves that these, they're necessary, right? And they are kind of. And so when we have that little happiness in our brain, says science, we're more likely to really love shoes, to be drawn to buy them. And so this is not a weakness, you guys who share this with me. This is science. This is part of how we're built. And so when my husband and I first got married, we had a little miscommunication about shoes, one might say. And I was trying to explain about shoes and how it's a fun thing. I enjoy it. It's more like a hobby. And he was saying more like, but they go on your feet. They protect you from the... No. It's more like a hobby. It's an enjoyable thing. So I can tell you, for example, about pretty much every pair of shoes I have. Like, the pair of shoes I'm wearing right now, they were made in the USA, which is hard to find. They're about $40. I bought them in June. I was really excited to get them in the mail. They're from shoes.com. And I texted my friend a picture of them as soon as they arrived, my friend who also likes shoes. So my husband didn't get this, and he's here, but watch this. Okay. When Syracuse basketball last won the national championship, who was the center? Basketball.
Oh, pray for it.
There you go. So when I would spout off where I got my shoes, I said, it's the same. It's just like sports. Right? So once we came to that understanding, it was all good. He said, oh, shoes are your sports. Now I get it. This doesn't apply to all of us. I understand. And we usually, we don't usually gender stereotype like this, but in this case, oh yeah. I love shoes. And now we know it's science, so I'm allowed, right? I love having a great pair of shoes, and especially when I started preaching, I love being a couple inches taller. I think it just helps, when you go to speak to people, you want to have a good pair of shoes on. There's a quote that usually gets attributed to Marilyn Monroe, but actually it's Bette Midler. But she said, give a woman a good pair of shoes and she can rule the world. I think this is true. You stand in a good pair of shoes and you feel really good about yourself. So what if I was Moses and God came to me in the middle of the night or while I was preaching and said, hey, you, take off your shoes. I would say, no, I like these shoes. And more than that, I need these shoes. I got to have them to preach. They make me feel better. They make me feel confident. And also there's that whole thing about protecting your feet from the elements, whatever. I need the shoes to be able to have this confidence. So if God came to me and said, take off your shoes, I was thinking I'd have a little bit of a problem. And so did Moses. I don't know where he was on the shoe spectrum, but he was a shepherd. He's out in the middle of the desert. It's the middle of the night, and I would guess that he's more on the spectrum of shoes protect your feet, right? In the middle of the desert, he's got to have them on. And so when he sees the talking shrubbery, you guys remember that story, when he sees the talking flaming, burning shrubbery that's not burning up, and he turns aside to look at it, and there it is, and the voice of God, the first thing that God says is, take off your sandals. Did anybody notice if Moses actually does it or not? It doesn't say. I think he was wondering, God doesn't ask this really of anybody else in the Bible. A few other times God tells them to take off their shoes, but this is a Moses thing. I mean, he's in the middle of the desert. It's cold out there. There's a flaming bush right next to him, and God says, take off your shoes because this is holy ground. And what did Moses do? He didn't take off his shoes. It says he hid his face. He didn't want to take off anything to face God. When he's faced with the angel of the Lord, he needs everything he's got. He needs his sandals for confidence, and he hides his face because he doesn't want God to see him as he really is. God keeps giving Moses, in the middle of this, sign after sign after sign to say, you don't need shoes, you don't need anything. I'm going to be with you. All those things that you think are going to protect you, all those things that you hold on to, all those crutches, you don't need them. If you guys thought that was a long reading, I cut a bunch of it out to spare you. There is way more to the story. Did you notice in the story that every time God comes to Moses and asks him to do something, it says, but Moses. Every time God comes to him and says, Moses, I need you to do this. I need you to just take off your sandals just out of respect. I want you to stand before me just as you are. It says, but Moses had a lot of questions. And then Moses said, God, I need a sign. Give me a sign. Aside from the flaming shrubbery that talked. Give me a sign, God. And so God says, because God is so patient with Moses, God says, okay, take that staff in your hand. He's a shepherd, right? This part is part of the story. It's too long, had to sum up. But in this story, God says to Moses, take your staff, throw it down. So here's Moses. Maybe he's barefoot, out in the middle of the desert. He throws his staff down, and it becomes a snake. Do you guys remember this part? I'm out right there, barefoot in the middle of the desert, and there's a snake slithering around, my biggest fear. And so God says, Moses, that's your sign. And then he says to Moses, and here is where I'd really be taking off across the desert, pick up the snake by the tail. Okay, God. Somehow Moses has the courage, and think of him being barefoot, reaching down, picking up the snake by the tail, and it becomes a staff again. And I imagine God saying something like, ta-da, there's your sign. The talking shrubbery, flaming, not enough. The staff, not enough. But Moses. Poor barefoot Moses. It's not enough for him. He comes back to God and says, okay, well, what am I going to call you? What am I going to name you? Because, everybody needs a name. There are gods here and gods there, gods everywhere in that society. What's your name? And God doesn't even give him that. God says, I am who I am. That's all I'm going to give you. That's all you've got to deal with. But then God goes on to say, I'm the God of history. I'm on your side. I'm going to help you. God does everything for Moses. And then, of course, again, it says, but Moses. Moses, yet again, God comes to him and says, lead my people. And when it gets right down to it, Moses, at the end, he gets real honest. And he says, God, send someone else. After all of these signs that, we beg for that, we ask God, please just let me know for sure about this thing or that thing. Moses has had, the voice of God out of the shrub. Moses has had this sign of a snake and a staff. Moses has heard the voice of God. God has revealed God's name. What more does Moses want? And still he says, please just send someone else. I can't do this. I'm not a good speaker. I don't do the public speaking, he says. I have a friend who, she doesn't know what I do for a living, really, but she said, I don't really like the public speaking thing, you know what I mean? We were going to a group, and she said, I don't really like to introduce myself because I don't like to speak in front of people, you know? And I was like, no, I don't know. I can imagine. But I think a lot of us say this, even as speaker types. God, I'm not that great at this. But God keeps saying, I'm going to be with you. You don't even need the shoes that you're wearing because I'm going to protect you. You stand in front of me, I can see everything you've ever done anyway. You might as well take off your shoes and get to work and do what I asked you to do. And so Moses, the final thing, when he says, God, send someone else, I think that's when God hears Moses saying where he really is. Because when God asks us to take off our shoes, figuratively, I think, not necessarily literally, when we're standing on holy ground, God is asking us to be vulnerable. And God is asking us to step out in faith and trust that even if we're not wearing our big girl confident shoes, that God is going to give us the words to say. That even if we don't have everything we need, even if we're not the best speaker in the world, or whatever excuse the dog ate it, Moses comes up with every excuse there is, God doesn't talk about Moses. God only talks about God. Because it's not about us and our talents. God uses those for God's glory. It's about what God's going to do with us, shoeless, hopeless, with all of our past, with everything we bring, just like Moses. It's how God is going to use us in other people's life. When we stand before God and we've got nothing left and we just say, God, send someone else, I'm not good enough. God says, I am. And God will go before us and God will lead us. And when we stand before God and God asks us to serve, and we get to the point where we just say to God, here I am, like Moses, the very first thing he said. I think then we're right where God wants us. We're vulnerable enough to say to God, I'm all you've got. And God says right back to us, I am. And that's all you need to know. Amen.